Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Proof is Out There. In the book of Exodus, God used a cloud to guide Moses and his people through the desert. But these days, people are talking about a different type of cloud control. Are aliens using clouds for cover? July 2015. Hector Garcia is hanging out in his neighborhood in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He is enjoying the summer weather when he suddenly notices something bizarre floating in the sky above him.
It's a cloud with lights in it, moving weird.
The aerial object can best be described as a shape-shifting, semi-transparent cloud-like mass. It hovers and follows a set of power lines until it drifts out of sight behind homes. The cloud's seemingly guided behavior has led to Hector's video going viral, racking up over 1 million clicks on YouTube.
Some people looking at this see that inside this amorphous blob, there seem to be glowing or shimmering lights. And it looks like this object is intelligently going to a destination.
Now, at first, I figured this could just be some floating debris. After all, Aero, the Pentagon's UAP identification team, said that's just exactly what many sightings turn out to be. But look at those twinkling lights. Tidal says the object's behavior reminds her of an alleged ET phenomenon known as cloud cloaking.
This is the theory that a UFO will hide itself either within a cloud or mask itself to look like a cloud so that it can hover inobtrusively.
Some say that aliens use cloud cloaking for one primary reason.
The idea is that the UFOs aren't just using clouds as cover. They're cloaking themselves so they can observe us and gather data on us without our realizing it.
Believers point to examples like this video posted in 2016 of a cloud-shaped UFO that suddenly disappears. And Tidal adds that another decades-old photo could show this may not be the first time aliens have utilized this technique.
On November 17, 1974, H. Laursen of Viborg, Denmark, saw something strange in the sky.
Laursen took out his camera and captured this strangely shaped cloud that appears in the shape of a classic UFO, with almost tentacle-like appendages underneath it.
This caused some to wonder, is this actually a naturally occurring object or something alien cloaking itself to look natural? Ultimately, his sighting was investigated by the Danish Air Force, but no one could ever determine what exactly it was that he saw. Is this sighting in Philadelphia also something that we've just never seen in the sky before? Could this be definitive evidence of UFO cloud cloaking?
I've never seen no like that.
NASA's Earth Observatory estimates that nearly 2/3 of Earth's surface is covered by clouds at any given time. That's a whole lot of space for UFOs to be hiding in. But which one do we see in this video? UFO? Cloud? Both? Neither? Our experts are ready to clear things up. To begin, could this incident have simply been faked? Physicist Matthew Shadagas thinks the answer is not in what we see, but what we hear.
The eyewitness seemed pretty surprised and natural to me.
It's a cloud with lights in it.
So from their behavior, it's probably not a hoax, and it's probably someone who is genuinely surprised by what they are seeing.
So if what we're seeing is real, is it something that's supposed to be floating in the sky? Could it just be a cloud?
Initially, I thought this was a cloud off in the distance. But when clouds experience a lot of wind, they will disperse, oftentimes lose its shape. This is not what we saw here. It looks exactly the same at the end of the video as it does in the very beginning of the video.
If it's not a natural phenomenon like a cloud, could it be something found closer to Earth?
There's a dead giveaway moment right here where the object looks pretty close to a shopping bag. And I think I can make out what look like handles. And then, to me, that looks like a wind gust picking up and blowing a plastic bag.
And if it is, in fact, a plastic bag, Shadagas believes he can easily explain why it sparkles.
If it's something like a plastic bag, this could simply be light from the sun refracting in weird ways.
But watch as the object moves past the TV antenna and behind the houses. If it is a floating shopping bag, it would have to be an extraordinary and unusually large one. For Hernandez, the plastic bag explanation also doesn't make sense, especially given the weather conditions that day.
It's off in the distance, and within 10 seconds, it's right on us. So it might be moving at over 50 miles an hour, but the winds this specific day were fairly light. They were 5 to 10 miles an hour. It's a clear day, high pressure over the region. It just doesn't make sense with what we're looking at here.
But that doesn't mean Hernandez thinks this is alien cloud cloaking technology.
If there was an alien species that was trying to develop an object to blend in, they would obviously have to know that clouds don't look like this normally. If it's a UFO that is practicing cloaking, it's not doing a good job.
So if it's not a UFO, what is it?
Whatever this is, it's changing direction. It takes a nosedive, but before it reaches the ground, it goes horizontally. And this behavior leads me to believe that there is some control that something or someone has over this object. And I don't have an explanation to that. It remains unidentified.
Our verdict? This is a genuine UFO, though not necessarily the extraterrestrial kind. This object doesn't move like a cloud, and we're not exactly sure what it's made of or how it's staying aloft. This feels like one of those cases where you will need to step up and help us out. So if you know anything about this incident, please reach out. Now, let's move on to another favorite topic of ours, lake monsters. Forget Loch Ness. Legend has it that something monstrous is stirring at the bottom of Lake Superior. And forget legends. Thanks to modern technology, we may finally have actual evidence about what's going on down there. June 2022, Lake Superior, in between Michigan and Wisconsin. Fisherman Andrew Bysick is out on his boat with a group of friends using sonar to scan for the lake's catch of the day. Suddenly, Andrew spots something strange.
We were having a good time, and then this came across the screen, and I said, "Hey, everybody, come look at this."
A screen grab of Andrew's sonar shows a mysterious shape swimming at the bottom of the lake. You can see what appears to be a long neck and a small head connected to a cylindrical body with a long tail and a potential fin.
It looks like it's 60 or 80 feet long. First thing that jumped out at me is this kind of looks like the Loch Ness Monster.
Field researcher Ken Gerhardt is not one bit surprised that this image was found in Lake Superior.
In Lake Superior, there is a creature known as Pressy, named after the nearby Presque Island River. The physical descriptions are always very similar. A giant snake-like animal, about 75 feet in length, with a horse-like head, 2 distinct pectoral fins, snake-like tail, and perhaps most intimidating, a mouth rimmed with razor-sharp teeth.
Legends of Pressy stretch back to the late 1800s, but it wasn't until 1977 that someone was thought to have captured actual photographic evidence of the creature.
A gentleman was staying at the Presque Isle campground when he managed to catch a photograph of which he believed was Pressy. He said it had the girth of a Volkswagen Bug.
Perhaps the most striking evidence of Pressy's existence is 400 years old.
There are some intriguing pictographs that are painted at Lake Superior Provincial Park of this giant, strange, snake-like animals hovering under a canoe filled with 5 people. And according to the local Ojibwe tribe, there are actually legends of the strange serpentine animal that is said to snatch people off of boats and devour them.
Sonar evidence may be the key to discovering the truth behind legends of the world's lake creatures. Back in 2016, a sonar-equipped submersible drone captured images deep inside Loch Ness of what appeared to be the lake's infamous monster. Unfortunately, it ended up being a 30-foot model of Nessie made for a movie that sank in the 1970s. But could this image be proof that Lake Superior's Pressy does in fact exist? Our experts dive in. Many online doubters claim that this footage is showing nothing more than a large sturgeon fish. But biologist Floyd Hayes says that's highly improbable.
Sturgeons can grow really large. However, the largest sturgeons in the Great Lakes are only about 8 feet long. This thing here, it would be too long to be a sturgeon.
So could this be some prehistoric creature like Pressy? Marine biologist Shay Steingast says the gigantic aquatic dinosaur known as the plesiosaur could have lived in this specific area once upon a time.
Plesiosaurs are known to have existed in North America. At first glance, this looks like it could be maybe a plesiosaur. I can see how you might interpret this as something like a head and a long neck with a body.
However, Steingast believes the truth behind this creature lies in the proper interpretation of how sonar captures images.
We can see that the supposed plesiosaur has different colors throughout the image, and those colors indicate density. If we were looking at a singular animal, all of that coloration would be red. Instead, what we're probably seeing are two dense areas of organisms, along with a weaker area of organisms that is that blue coloration.
So then, what exactly is it that Andrew found on his sonar?
What I think we're seeing here is maybe two separate schools of fish within a bed of lakeweed and a school of fish nearby with some other fish trailing off. And that would make a lot of sense biologically because fish tend to hang out in protected, vegetated areas within the Great Lakes. I think this might be a case where there is an apparent image that we're looking at that's really easy to misinterpret.
Our verdict, for better or worse, this image is showing us several schools of fish, not a plesiosaur like the infamous Pressy. And while that may be the case this time, the legend of Pressy certainly rages on as reported sightings continue. So keep your eyes and your sonar trained on those deep lake beds. When it comes to UFOs, observers typically see traits such as defying gravity without any visible means of propulsion, or abilities like instantaneous acceleration that physics can't explain. Now, we may have found something else to add to the list. Take a look. November 2022, Homestead, Florida. Dylan Thompson is taking a leisurely stroll through a parking lot when he sees something odd materializing in the night sky. He records this. A glittering trail of flaming light streams ominously from the heavens. Suddenly, it splits into 7 light trails that eventually morph into 9 orbs. Then, as you can see here, each orb suddenly halts its descent, seeming to float with purpose before fading out, one by one, into the night sky.
These lights do not look natural. This is some kind of technology, or there's something driving these lights.
The phenomenon seems to be eerily similar to another sighting we featured in an earlier proof episode of lights that appeared near Warminster, England. And the way these lights split up on descent reminds Tidal of an intriguing theory.
In 1949, engineer, physicist, and computer scientist John von Neumann introduced the world to his idea of universal assemblers. This is a type of UFO that is basically a self-replicating robot, and these robots can create more of themselves as they explore the universe.
Von Neumann's theory is that these probes explore the universe, mining essential raw materials from asteroids, moons, and planets. It's that mining which allows them to self-replicate, creating the ability for long-distance space travel.
These are sometimes called von Neumann probes, and they're said to replicate the way viruses or living organisms behave.
But Tidal notes that some believe there could be a more earthly, albeit ominous, explanation.
It's possible some would see this as evidence of some kind of preparation for space war.
A space war? Tidal says our military believes space could be the next battleground.
The media has widely reported that the Pentagon is preparing for a future space war, with nations like Russia and China launching increasing satellites that have weapons that can destroy communication satellites. The White House is proposing a $30 billion budget for the U.S. Space Force, which is $4 billion more than last year.
With deep pockets, is it possible that the U.S. Space Force is testing new offensive or defensive weapons designed to protect rockets at launch? Or could these lights be evidence of a von Neumann probe? Our experts have big thoughts on this one. Physicist Matthew Shadagis explores the von Neumann probe theory.
A bright streak seems to split into several streaks, all falling downwards. That behavior does seem to point towards some of the alleged cases of self-replicating UFOs.
But it's that slow downward trend that has Shadagis convinced we're likely looking at something more earthly than alien.
I don't see any sort of zigzaggy pattern that's associated with classic UFO cases. I do see a downward fall that is probably due to gravity, and that makes me think that there's probably a natural explanation.
Could the strange lights have anything to do with the big budget increases over at Space Force? Maybe Space Force was testing a new type of defensive weapon used to protect rockets from missile attack. Decoy pyrotechnic countermeasures have protected jet fighters for decades. Aviation expert Tim McMillan weighs in.
Countermeasures are employed as a means of thwarting missile targeting systems or systems that are targeting aircraft using infrared or thermal signatures. And the object behind that is to steer a missile away from the aircraft and into the flares. But it's not consistent with thermal countermeasures. The real big clue for me in this video is if you watch it, you'll notice that there appears to be aviation navigation lights of an aircraft.
McMillan says those lights and the location could be the keys to solving the mystery.
The Air Force Reserve Base in Homestead, Florida, happens to be the winter training facility for the U.S. Army's parachute team, the Golden Knights. They do exactly what I think we see here, which are pyrotechnic night jumps.
The Golden Knights consist of more than 100 elite skydivers who appear around the country to promote the U.S. Army. Watch closely as the single flare becomes multiple ones. That's each skydiver peeling off after jumping as a group.
And if you look at other pyrotechnic skydivers, this video is very similar to that.
The verdict? We're going with pyrotechnic skydivers. While we weren't able to confirm with the Golden Knights if they were jumping on this particular night, we agreed that McMillan's observations do seem to point to a fiery skydive display. These next photos have had the Bigfoot community intrigued for over 2 decades. And the content of the photos is strangely not the only thing that's got us scratching our heads. December 2000, Sarasota County, Florida. The Sarasota Sheriff's Department is going through their mail when they receive something bizarre from an anonymous source. A typed letter reads, "Enclosed, please find some pictures I took in late September or early October of 2000. My husband says he thinks it's an orangutan." The attached photos are terrifying, depicting an ape-like creature crouched behind foliage, its eyes glowing red. The author estimates the creature to be 6.5 to 7 feet tall while kneeling. As the letter continues, "Please find out where this animal came from. It shouldn't be loose like this. Someone will get hurt." The author's identity remains a mystery. Still, field researcher Cliff Barrickman believes we could be looking at some bona fide Bigfoot evidence.
I've seen a lot of purported Sasquatch photographs in my time, and this is one of the better ones because you can see a fair amount of detail, and it is just kind of creepy. All over the country, whenever Sasquatches are observed, people would call them a variety of local names. And in Florida, they started calling these animals skunk apes.
Rumored to have an aggressive stench like rotting meat or raw sewage, the infamous skunk ape has been the subject of numerous alleged encounters, like this 2015 footage shot in Tampa and this video filmed in the Everglades in 2000. We concluded both those videos were hoaxes. Still, accounts of Floridians running afoul of this creature go all the way back to the 1800s.
The earliest report that I could uncover comes from 1816, when a man reported seeing a man-sized monkey run off into the woods in Apalachicola, Florida. People have reported being stalked by them. I know of one witness that was up in his tree stand and he heard something coming at him, and when he looked down, there was one of these things crawling up the tree after him with red glowing eyes.
In fact, it's the red glowing eyes in these photos that lead many to believe they are proof of an authentic Sasquatch. Remember, many researchers believe this creature is distantly related to humans.
Many reports of Sasquatches at night are accompanied by red eye shine. And humans have a red reflectivity to their eye as well in photographs. The flash reflects off the retina, and that red shine is actually the blood vessels on the back of one's eye.
Outside of primates, most animals don't have that red shine because of reflective tissue behind their retinas called the tapetum lucidum. This tissue enables low light visibility for animals, and it's also the reason your cat's eyes might have a green or blue tint in photos at night.
People hold up these photographs as evidence of the red eye shine, and maybe they're right.
Investigators were able to verify that these photos were indeed developed in Sarasota County right around the time of the alleged incident. So we know at least the location and the time frame check out, but what about this creature? Let's check in with our experts. The author of this strange letter suggests this creature is an orangutan, but anthropologist Kathy Strain says this is no such creature.
You can tell this isn't an orangutan because of the grayness in the hair. Orangs don't gray like that. Plus, their orangs are well known to be hairless on their face.
So could this be the infamous skunk ape? What about that red eye shine, commonly found in humans and primates?
For me, when I have my photo taken, only my pupils are red. It's not the entire eye. And in that photo, the entire eye is red. That tells me something else is going on.
Anatomist and Bigfoot expert Jeff Meldrum agrees that what we're seeing here isn't natural eye shine.
I could imagine an artificial eye with a smooth surface reflecting the flash from a camera. That might explain the appearance of the eye somehow self-illuminating.
Like an artificial eye, you might see in a mask with plastic eye lenses. And according to Meldrum, the legitimacy of these photos has been foiled by the foliage.
The biggest soft palmetto leaves are 3 feet across. So the most glaring inconsistency was the assertion that the figures that she encountered were 6.5 to 7 feet in height. Even if this was the largest saw palmetto leaf, it would make that figure only about 4 feet tall. So the credibility of the remainder of the letter is drawn into question.
Our verdict? We think that this is probably a hoax due to the strange letter and the odd aspects of the creature itself. That being said, no one has been able to find the costume or prop in these photos, and whoever orchestrated this whole thing has never come forward to claim credit. So there's still a possibility, however small, that the skunk ape is still out there somewhere. In the 1940s and 50s, the term flying saucer was practically synonymous with UFO. The acronym was coined around the same time. You're about to see one of the most famous photos ever taken of a flying saucer. And decades later, it is still raising some big questions. November 1951, Riverside, California. Guy Marquand Jr. and a couple of friends are taking in the scenic hillside when something in the sky breaks the stillness.
Marquand reported seeing this object flying extremely fast overhead. He ran to grab his camera, then took this snapshot.
The black and white photo could hardly make it any clearer. In the sky above a sloping hill soars a crisp-edged disc with a domed top and a high-contrast metallic sheen.
Of all the famous early UFO photographs, this has that classic flying saucer look. But really, flying saucer mania started 4 years earlier with pilot Kenneth Arnold in 1947.
In June of 1947, Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington when he witnessed something that would make UFO history.
He saw a bright flash to the northeast and looked over to see that it was 9 shining objects. He described these objects as kind of like pie plates or saucers. The media then took that description and coined the term flying saucer.
And with that, this new UFO craze took off.
In the months after Arnold's original sighting, more eyewitnesses saw something similar to what he described. Within months, 90% of the country knew and was familiar with the term flying saucer.
Among the many flying saucers and depictions that followed Arnold's came the Riverside UFO. The big difference? unlike Arnold, Guy Marquand Jr. had actual photographic evidence. Flying saucers have kind of gone out of fashion. In 2023, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office dubbed orbs the most common UFO shape among recent reports. In contrast, discs, or flying saucers, comprised only 2%. So were flying saucers ever real? And if so, why are we seeing different UFOs now? And the big question, is the photo legit? We turn first to astronomer Mark D'Antonio to ask, could a flying saucer even fly?
Here I am moving the UFO from one side to the other. It went from here to here. But what if I can make it disappear from here and just appear right here? Maybe they're disc-shaped because they're particle accelerators that allow them to pop out of our 4 dimensions and then pop back in.
Particle accelerators produce beams of electrically charged atomic or subatomic particles. They're often circular, so the beams can travel in a continuous loop. And astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy says there's another reason the saucer might make a good spaceship.
The flying saucer shape could allow the craft to function as a centrifuge. So you could simulate whatever gravity your home planet had by spinning it faster or slower as it's traveling.
This is because a centrifuge creates a sustained rotational force that causes your body's inertia to press you against the sides, effectively simulating gravity. If you've ever ridden the Gravitron at an amusement park, then you've experienced this firsthand.
So the flying saucer may actually be an ideal interstellar vehicle.
But then why has the ideal interstellar vehicle apparently fallen out of favor?
It's possible that there are other types of interstellar craft that have reached us from various civilizations. We're seeing flying saucers less often, but it doesn't mean that there aren't these types of UFOs out there.
So is this flying saucer a genuine UFO or the result of some kind of trick photography?
When I analyze this photo, it actually appears to be reflecting it exactly as one would expect something metallic with that shape to be behaving in the sky like that. So whatever this is, it was captured authentically in camera.
Yet while McCarthy believes it's a real object, he's not so sure it can't be identified.
If you take a look at car styles at the time, you'll notice that they all had a common feature called the hubcap.
Metal hubcaps are less common now, but back when this photo was taken, these shiny wheel protectors were everywhere. They often had a raised part in the center, similar to the domed top we see on this alleged UFO.
The shape very strongly resembles this flying saucer. So I think that's a much more plausible explanation than saying we got visitors from outer space.
And D'Antonio sees that too.
When we look at this, it's on an angle compared to the camera. Usually, things that are traveling in an arc through the sky are things that are, say, tossed. It's like a hubcap thing thrown like a frisbee off of this rock right here, and someone took a picture of it.
Our verdict? Thrown metal hubcap. The light, the angle, and the car design of that era just make it the most likely explanation. We can't say for sure, but we think these fun-loving folks from the 50s might have been pulling a fast one in the heyday of the flying saucer craze. The 2007 horror film Paranormal Activity is about a young couple who set up cameras to document a supernatural presence haunting their home. But what if something similar actually happened in real life? Well, get ready for the jump scare. It's March 2022, just southwest of Minneapolis in Shakopee, Minnesota. At about 10 o'clock at night, Joey Radke is watching TV in the master bedroom of the home he's renting. But out in the hallway, something spooky is about to go down. A CCTV camera is rolling as two cats run into the home's darkened living room and freeze. One of the cats pounces and the other darts behind a laundry basket and stares at the spot where it just came from. The family's third cat is nowhere to be seen. Then, 15 seconds later, a door closes and a shadowy figure appears to walk out of a room into the hall. Take a closer look. We used Luma and color effects to up the contrast and enhance the image. The shape looks like a woman in a dress, with her hair puffed up on top of her head. The form is gone as quickly as it came, but now orbs are seen flying through the room. Joey finds the footage after his wife, who was out of town at the time, gets an alert on her phone.
My oldest stepson was kind of freeze framing it frame by frame. And when he captured it, we all jumped and said, you know, that's a woman standing in our hallway wearing a nightgown with that kind of bouffant, kind of beehive-ish hair.
Joey says he had long heard rumors that the home he rented may be haunted.
The friends of ours who own the home say that there was a previous homeowner before they lived there that ended up passing away in the master bedroom, and the neighbors said that it looked like the gal that did live there that did pass away.
Joey shares that before this incident was caught on camera, his wife had woken up several times late at night with the feeling that there was an eerie presence at the foot of the bed. And some believe the strange behavior of Joey's cats adds some weight to the idea that a spirit was present.
Cats sense what we don't sense. One of the most infamous cases of a precognitive cat is a cat by the name of Oscar. Now, Oscar was adopted by a nursing and rehabilitation center in Providence, Rhode Island. But Oscar had this uncanny ability to detect what would invariably be the death of a patient. He would get up on the bed and curl up, and the patient would pass away.
So can cats detect spirits, coming or departing? Some studies have found that cats actually do know more than humans. It's said they feel certain vibrations and can sense negativity coming from people. So let's have our experts channel their best feline intuition to unravel this spirited yarn. Catholic miracle researcher Michael O'Neill says the concept of ghosts does have a place in Catholic tradition.
There's this idea that the soul outlives the body. And Catholics also believe in purgatory, this space between living on earth and your final destination. The thought is that perhaps ghosts are those people who are souls in purgatory.
So is this the ghost of the former owner manifesting in her own purgatory? And does Joey's wife's experience of waking up to see a spirit reinforce that?
Perhaps we can attribute this to somebody being awoken from REM sleep and having a hallucination. Their brain is projecting images into their physical space, which makes them feel that it's actually real.
That may provide an explanation for why some people see ghosts, but this was a camera seeing it. So we went to forensic video analyst Mick West, and he has a theory on what's happening.
We know that they have 3 cats, which leads to the possibility that what we're actually seeing over here might just be a cat. We see something coming in, but all we're seeing really is just kind of a collection of pixels. It could well be that this is a cat. Perhaps this is its tail over here. We really don't know because the camera is really bad.
And West thinks that this low-resolution CCTV camera can explain why we have such a hard time identifying what's going on.
We see this little kind of jump in the video here. That's the video kind of updating itself, catching up with the compression. Videos are split into what's called I-frames and P-frames. I-frames are actual images, and P-frames are predicted images. They're what the compression algorithm thinks is going to be in that particular image based on the previous frame. And I think what might have happened here, the cat walked into this room and then jumped up onto the top of whatever's here, a little shelf or a dresser or something.
Mystery solved? Not exactly. Joey says that theory might make sense, but in reality, it's physically impossible.
It's just an empty hallway. There's no shelves or anything where a cat would jump onto.
Our verdict? Unidentified, which is as close to saying it's a ghost as we're willing to go. West may be onto something with the theory that this is Joey's missing 3rd cat. But if that's the case, then what is it jumping onto? And what were those strange orbs we see flying through? If only the other 2 scaredy cats could talk. Mars has 2 moons, Deimos and Phobos, which were discovered way back in 1877. Phobos orbits Mars near its equator 3 times a day. It is so close to the planet's surface that it's not visible from some locations on Mars. But when it's caught on camera, what can be seen is something that's out of this world. September 12, 1998. The Mars Global Surveyor is 2 years into its mission to monitor Mars. It's above Phobos when its camera captures a surprising sight that amateur astronomer Efren Palermo then discovers on NASA's website.
I was looking through the images and kind of finding anomalies. That's when I saw something a little bit out of place.
Efren is looking at an enormous protrusion on the Mars moon's surface. You can tell from the shadow this thing is tall.
Phobos is a very small moon, and there's no geologic reason to have a structure sticking out like that.
This feature rises 300 feet into the sky, making it almost as tall as London's Big Ben. Author and lecturer Jason Martell says it seems to be cylindrical, with a slanted top, so many believe it can't be natural.
Many areologists have studied the idea that this could be some type of a monolith.
But this structure is as big as a building, so as strange as it seems, some people have speculated that it could be some type of futuristic dwelling. In fact, it looks a bit like Marcia, a 3D printed vertical home designed right here on Earth as a model for sustainable living on the red planet. Marcia's dual shell egg shape allows for the use of less material and balances the need for greater Earth-like atmospheric pressure inside, with Mars's thinner atmosphere outside.
The structure of these towers is taller and leaner in mass, making them ideal for climate conditions on Mars. Perhaps these structures are indicative of the intelligent design needed to create weather-resistant Martian structures.
Don't buy it? Well, there's an even more out-there theory. This structure looks a bit like the plastic-protected antennas on an old Nokia cell phone. So maybe it's an antenna or some other communication device attached to a larger spacecraft. That spacecraft being Phobos itself.
Soviet scientist Iosif Shklovsky concluded that Phobos was most likely hollow inside, with possibly a thin sheet of metal exterior. Originally thought to be an asteroid captured by Mars gravity, scientists thought that the drag from the atmosphere was causing Phobos to sink its orbit by almost 2 inches a year. And for that to happen, some said it had to be hollow, like a man-made artificial satellite.
Astronaut Buzz Aldrin thought the Phobos monolith would generate public curiosity when its existence became widely known. And he was right. We've got to ask, who or what put that there? Fortunately, we have some experts on hand to give us the lowdown on this Martian moon mystery. First, astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy speaks to whether the Phobos monolith could be an alien communication tower.
The irregular shape of this structure would make it difficult for communications as we understand it. The communications dishes we're familiar with would be symmetrical, with an antenna for omnidirectional transmitting and receiving.
McCarthy also suggests that Soviet scientist Iosif Shklovsky's idea that Phobos could be a hollowed-out spacecraft is, well, hollow, thanks to new info about Phobos and its twin moon, Deimos.
It's not that Shklovsky did bad science. It's that they had bad data to work with. Today, we're fairly certain they're completely solid and similar to many other asteroids out there.
And as far as this being a dwelling modeled on designs like Marcia,
it's just really coincidental that they have a similar shape to what the design is right now for Marcia, but it's definitely made up of rock material that's local to the region. You can see that it is a rock formation.
So then, what exactly is this Phobos monolith, and how did it get here?
Most likely, it's impact ejecta. It could have formed from an impact onto the surface of Phobos, but it also could be a meteorite that was heading towards the sun and intersected with Phobos, and what you're seeing is a piece of just laying there.
The first time the question was asked in the control room, it did not sound like a question at all, but more like a provocation whispered into the dark. A challenge thrown at the very idea of certainty. Because the proof is out there has always lived in that narrow space between what we think we know and what stubbornly refuses to be explained. And in this opening chapter, the camera does not rush. It lingers, it breathes. It watches dust float through beams of artificial light, while monitors glow, with paused frames of impossible And the narrator's voice sets the tone, not as a preacher, but as a careful guide who knows that belief is fragile and skepticism is necessary, introducing a compilation of cases that at first glance seem unrelated, but soon begin to echo one another in quiet, unsettling ways. Starting with a grainy video recorded by a farmer at dawn where a metallic object, no larger than a delivery van, hovers just above a cornfield, its surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that it appears to dissolve into the air. An object that skeptics immediately label a drone or an optical illusion, while believers insist the camouflage itself is the point. And the episode frames this debate not as a shouting match, but as a methodical autopsy of the footage, slowing it down, enhancing contrast, isolating pixels, comparing it with known aircraft signatures. And already the theme is clear that disguise may be the oldest trick in the unknown's book, because if something wanted to hide in plain sight, what better way than to look like nothing at all? And from there the narrative pivots to the forests of the Pacific Northwest, where a hiker's audio recording captures heavy rhythmic footsteps accompanied by a low guttural breathing that does not match any cataloged animal. And again, the show resists sensationalism, instead inviting zoologists, sound engineers, and wilderness experts to dissect the clip, measuring stride length from sound delay, matching breathing patterns to known mammals, only to arrive at the same unsettling conclusion that while each individual element can be explained, the combination remains stubbornly anomalous, suggesting that the legend of Sasquatch persists not because people want to believe, but because certain experiences refuse to fit into comfortable boxes. And throughout the episode, the editing weaves these cases together, cutting from open skies to dense forests, from advanced technology to primal wilderness, as if to suggest that the unknown wears many masks but follows similar rules. And what elevates this chapter beyond a simple case study is its focus on the human observers themselves, the witnesses whose lives have been quietly reshaped by moments they cannot forget. Like the farmer who admits that he sold the land shortly after the sighting not out of fear, but because the field no longer felt like it belonged solely to him. Or the hiker who confesses that every time he hears branches snap, now he feels a flicker of anticipation rather than terror, as if some door in his mind has been permanently left ajar. And these personal testimonies are treated with respect, not as punchlines, reinforcing the show's central thesis that evidence is not only what can be measured but also what can be endured. And as the experts continue their analysis, the episode introduces historical parallels. Archival reports from the 1950s describing reflective discs that mirror clouds, indigenous stories of forest guardians whose presence was known by sound alone, drawing careful lines without claiming direct continuity, yet implying that modern sightings may be refracted echoes of much older narratives. And the skepticism is always present, grounding the discussion with meteorological data explaining temperature inversions, with biologists demonstrating how bears can produce surprisingly human-like vocalizations. But even these explanations feel provisional, like temporary scaffolding erected around a structure not yet fully understood. And the most compelling moment arrives when a former aerospace engineer demonstrates how experimental stealth technology uses adaptive surfaces to bend light, admitting that while current models cannot achieve the seamless invisibility seen in the farmer's video, the principle itself is no longer science fiction, blurring the line between extraterrestrial hypothesis and secret human innovation. And this ambiguity becomes the emotional engine of the episode, because if the object was not alien, then it implies knowledge withheld, and if it was alien, then it implies company in the universe, either possibility equally destabilizing. And as the narrative unfolds, the camera returns to the forest case, now enhanced with thermal imaging that reveals a heat signature moving upright between trees, briefly obscured, then gone. And the analysts pause, not speaking, letting the silence do the work, because silence in this show is not absence but space for thought. And when the discussion resumes, it centers on probability, on how often rare events can occur without violating natural law, on how the human brain is wired to seek patterns even when randomness reigns. Yet the show never allows probability to become a dismissal, instead treating it as one more tool in the kit. And by the end of this first part, the separate threads begin to braid together through a simple question posed by the narrator. What if disguise is not meant to deceive us completely, but to slow us down, to make certainty impossible, to keep us forever investigating? And this idea resonates as the episode revisits earlier footage now overlaid with new data, showing how easily assumptions can shift with context, how the same image can transform from mundane to extraordinary with a single altered variable, and the closing minutes focus on the methodology itself. The process of inquiry as the true protagonist of the proof is out there, emphasizing that the show's mission is not to prove or debunk, but to document the pursuit of understanding, to honor curiosity without surrendering rigor. And the final shot lingers on a paused frame of the hovering object, half visible, half lost in glare, while the narrator reminds us that history is full of moments when today's impossibility became tomorrow's textbook diagram, leaving the viewer suspended in that familiar yet thrilling uncertainty where wonder and doubt coexist, setting the stage for deeper dives to come. Because if this is only the beginning, then the disguises have just started to slip. Part 2 opens without recap or reassurance, plunging directly into motion, as if the series itself understands that momentum is essential when dealing with mysteries that thrive on hesitation. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, shifts its gaze from isolated sightings to patterns that only emerge when incidents are placed side by side, layered across geography and time, beginning with a cluster of reports from the American Midwest, where multiple witnesses describe lights that do not simply move across the sky, but appear to study the landscape below, adjusting altitude and brightness in response to human activity. And the show carefully reconstructs one particular night using synchronized phone videos, police dash cams, and radar data, revealing that while each individual recording seems inconclusive, together they form a choreography too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. And yet the episode immediately complicates this impression by introducing a former military air traffic controller who explains how perspective distortion and synchronized civilian reactions can create the illusion of intelligent response, reminding the viewer that the human tendency to anthropomorphize is powerful, especially when fear or excitement primes perception. And this tension between collective pattern and collective error becomes the spine of the episode, because the proof is out there is less interested in declaring answers than in exposing how fragile our interpretive frameworks can be when stretched across multiple data points. And from the skies, the narrative descends back into the forest, this time following a trail of physical traces rather than fleeting sounds, focusing on a set of footprints discovered after a late autumn snowfall that extend for nearly 2 miles without deviation, each print unusually deep and narrow. And the forensic analysis is presented with meticulous care as anthropologists measure stride length, pressure, displacement, and toe splay, comparing them to known human and animal locomotion. And what emerges is not a dramatic declaration of a new species, but an uncomfortable gray zone where the prints do not conclusively belong to anything cataloged, forcing the experts to acknowledge uncertainty rather than force a fit. And this humility is crucial to the episode's tone because it reinforces the idea that mystery persists not because of ignorance, but because of intellectual honesty. And as the investigation unfolds, the show introduces a skeptical counterpoint in the form of a professional hoaxer who demonstrates how convincing footprints can be fabricated using weighted prosthetics. Yet even this demonstration fails to fully explain the consistency and endurance of the trail, leading to a rare moment where skeptic and believer find themselves aligned in confusion. And this alignment is framed as progress rather than failure, suggesting that shared uncertainty may be more valuable than polarized certainty. And interwoven throughout these analyses are interviews with witnesses whose emotional responses form a quiet undercurrent, such as a retired schoolteacher who describes watching a silent triangular craft glide overhead while her grandchildren played beneath it, her voice steady not with fear, but with a sense of intrusion, as if some unspoken boundary had been crossed. And her testimony is juxtaposed with that of a logger who recounts encountering an upright figure at the edge of a clearing, Its presence communicated not through aggression but through stillness. And these accounts are never dramatized with reenactments, instead relying on restrained visuals and ambient sound to allow the words themselves to carry weight, reinforcing the show's respect for lived experience without elevating it to unquestioned truth. And as part 2 progresses, the narrative begins to explore the concept of adaptive behavior, introducing the hypothesis that if unknown phenomena exist, they may alter their appearance or activity patterns in response to human observation, a notion supported by historical cases where sightings seem to shift form as technology advanced, from airships to saucers to drones. And while the show stops short of endorsing this theory, it treats it as a lens worth examining, inviting psychologists and historians to discuss how cultural expectations shape perception and how folklore evolves alongside technology, suggesting that the disguise may not belong to the phenomenon itself, but to the human mind attempting to make sense of it. And this reflexive turn is one of the episode's most compelling elements because it implicates the viewer directly, asking not only what is out there, but how we decide what we see. And the midpoint of the episode marks a subtle escalation as new evidence is introduced in the form of declassified documents referencing unidentified aerial encounters logged during routine training exercises, documents that are deliberately mundane in tone, yet unsettling in implication, describing objects that outperform known aircraft without dramatic language. And the experts debate whether bureaucratic understatement lends credibility or merely reflects institutional caution. And this debate mirrors the larger question of authority in knowledge production, challenging the assumption that official acknowledgement automatically equals truth, while also recognizing that absence of acknowledgement does not equal non-existence. And as night falls within the episode's chronology, the forest investigation reaches a turning point when motion-activated cameras capture fleeting images of a tall heat signature moving through dense brush. Images too indistinct to confirm identity, yet too coherent to ignore. And the analysts resist the urge to enhance beyond recognition, choosing instead to present the data with its flaws intact, a choice that underscores the show's ethical commitment to transparency. And this restraint allows the audience to engage critically rather than passively consume spectacle. And as the episode nears its conclusion, the disparate threads converge around a single unsettling idea articulated by a cognitive scientist who suggests that ambiguity itself may be the defining feature of these phenomena, not as a failure of evidence, but as an inherent quality, proposing that certain experiences may exist at the edge of human perceptual capability, always partially obscured, always inviting interpretation without resolution. And this idea reframes frustration as feature, positioning uncertainty not as a temporary obstacle, but as a permanent condition of inquiry. And the final sequence returns to the Midwest skies, where a new sighting mirrors the earlier ones, yet differs in subtle ways. Its light spectrum slightly altered, its movement pattern less predictable, prompting the narrator to ask whether this represents technological evolution, environmental variance, or simply the human tendency to notice differences once expectations are set. And the episode closes on a quiet moment of reflection rather than a cliffhanger, emphasizing that the pursuit of proof is not a linear journey toward a single revelation, but a continual process of questioning, revising, and listening, leaving the viewer with the sense that disguise may not be an act of deception, but a mirror held up to our own limitations, inviting humility as much as wonder, and reinforcing the series' central promise that while definitive answers may remain elusive, the act of investigation itself has value, shaping how we understand the world and our place within it. Part 3 unfolds with a subtle but deliberate shift in rhythm, as if the series senses that curiosity has ripened into expectation, and now it begins to test how much weight that expectation can bear, opening not with a spectacle, but with a laboratory. Fluorescent lights humming softly over rows of monitors, where analysts revisit old cases armed with new tools. And this choice immediately reinforces one of the proof is out there's quiet convictions that progress in understanding often happens, not in the field but in re-examination. When yesterday's noise becomes today's signal, And the episode centers on a set of UFO recordings dismissed years earlier as camera artifacts. Footage captured by early digital sensors notorious for producing lens flares and compression glitches. Yet when modern image stabilization and spectral analysis are applied, something unexpected emerges. Not a clean revelation, but a pattern of movement inconsistent with optical artifacts. Movements that curve rather than streak, that decelerate instead of fading, and the experts tread carefully, emphasizing that improved clarity does not equal confirmation, yet acknowledging that dismissal based solely on technological limitation may have been premature. And this recontextualization becomes a thematic mirror for the Sasquatch investigations that follow, where older plaster casts of footprints, long relegated to museum storage, are scanned with 3D modeling software, revealing micro-pressure ridges that suggest dynamic foot flexion rather than static stamping, details difficult to fake consistently. And while the show avoids declaring authenticity, it uses these findings to illustrate how time can alter not the evidence itself, but our ability to interrogate it. And as the narrative moves outward from the lab, the episode introduces a series of near-identical sightings reported decades apart in different countries. Hovering objects described with eerily similar language by witnesses with no cultural connection, and the show resists the temptation to frame this as proof of a single phenomenon, instead exploring the sociology of testimony, interviewing linguists who explain how humans independently arrive at comparable metaphors when describing unfamiliar stimuli, such as comparing unknown shapes to everyday objects, discs, triangles, shadows. And this linguistic convergence complicates the argument by suggesting that similarity does not necessarily imply sameness, yet it does not erase the lingering discomfort that arises when independent accounts align too closely to ignore, and this discomfort is amplified when the episode shifts focus to an unexpected domain, animal behavior, presenting cases where livestock exhibit sudden coordinated distress coinciding with aerial sightings, footage showing herd scattering moments before lights appear overhead, and veterinarians analyze stress markers, ruling out common predators or weather events, leaving the unsettling possibility that animals may perceive stimuli humans cannot, a notion that reframes the human observer not as the primary sensor, but as a delayed witness. And this idea carries into the forest investigations, where trail cameras capture wildlife reacting to something off-frame, heads snapping upward, bodies freezing, followed by a low-frequency vibration picked up by seismic sensors installed for unrelated geological studies, vibrations too weak to be felt, but strong enough to register, and the episode does not claim causation, yet places these data points side by side, allowing proximity to do the narrative work. And what makes this chapter particularly resonant is its attention to epistemology, the study of how we know what we know, as philosophers of science are invited to discuss falsifiability and the limits of empirical inquiry, reminding viewers that not all questions yield to the same methods, and that insisting on laboratory-grade proof for transient, rare events may be a category error rather than a rigorous standard. Yet the show balances this with caution, warning against lowering evidentiary thresholds simply to satisfy desire for wonder. And this balance is embodied in a debate between two recurring experts, one arguing that the accumulation of anomalies suggests an underlying reality yet to be named, the other maintaining that anomalies are inevitable in any large data set and do not require extraordinary explanations, and their exchange is presented not as a clash of egos, but as a demonstration of healthy scientific tension, modeling disagreement without dismissal, and interspersed throughout are intimate witness accounts that ground the abstraction, including a commercial pilot who recounts encountering an object that matched speed with his aircraft for several seconds before accelerating beyond known limits. His testimony delivered with professional restraint, emphasizing instrumentation readings rather than emotion, and a park ranger who describes finding a series of tree structures arranged in patterns inconsistent with storm damage or human activity, patterns that seem intentional yet inscrutable. And the show treats these narratives as data points with human texture rather than sensational centerpieces, And as Part 3 deepens, it begins to explore the psychological aftermath of unexplained encounters, citing studies on how ambiguity can alter memory consolidation, leading witnesses to relive events with increasing clarity, rather than distortion. A counterintuitive finding that challenges assumptions about unreliable memory. And this psychological angle becomes a bridge between UFO and Sasquatch cases, suggesting that the impact of the unknown may be as significant as its origin, shaping behavior, belief, and even career paths, as several witnesses reveal that their experiences led them to pursue scientific fields, motivated not by belief but by unanswered questions, and the episode's visual language reinforces this introspective turn, favoring long static shots over quick cuts, allowing silence to punctuate expert commentary, and when sound design swells it does so subtly, evoking tension without dictating interpretation, and the climax of Part 3 arrives not with a definitive discovery, but with a convergence of methodologies, as aerial footage, ground sensors, and eyewitness timelines from a single incident are synchronized for the first time, revealing a temporal alignment too precise to ignore. Lights appearing as vibrations register and wildlife reacts, yet still lacking a clear source. And the analysts acknowledge that while this convergence strengthens the case for an external stimulus, it remains agnostic about identity. And this honesty becomes the episode's quiet triumph, demonstrating that intellectual integrity can coexist with wonder. And in the closing moments, the narrator reflects on the human impulse to unmask disguises, to name and categorize, suggesting that perhaps some phenomena persist precisely because they resist final classification, serving as reminders of the provisional nature of knowledge. And the final image returns to the lab where an analyst pauses a frame, zooms in, then stops short of enhancement, choosing not to push beyond what the data can support. A gesture that encapsulates the ethos of the proof is out there, restraint as respect, curiosity as discipline, and as the screen fades the question lingers not as a challenge, but as an invitation, asking whether understanding requires answers or whether the pursuit itself reshapes us, leaving the viewer poised for what comes next, aware that with each layer peeled back the mystery does not shrink but deepens, demanding patience rather than resolution. Part 4 begins with a deliberate widening of scope, as if the series recognizes that individual cases, no matter how compelling, can only carry the investigation so far before they must be placed within a broader conceptual landscape. And so this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the Trees, opens with a map slowly filling with points of light, each marking a reported encounter, not clustered chaotically, but forming faint corridors and voids that immediately provoke questions about geography, environment, and human presence. And the narrator frames this not as evidence of intent, but as an invitation to examine correlation without surrendering to assumption, because patterns are seductive precisely when they appear to organize the unknown. And the episode proceeds to test these apparent corridors against variables such as population density, flight paths, wildlife migration routes, and geological fault lines, revealing that some alignments dissolve under scrutiny while others stubbornly persist, particularly along regions of magnetic anomaly where instruments have historically behaved unpredictably. And this scientific grounding lends the episode a sense of methodological escalation, moving from isolated anomalies to environmental context, suggesting that the phenomena under investigation may be less about singular events and more about interaction zones where human perception, technology, and natural forces intersect. And from this macro perspective, the narrative zooms back in on a specific case involving a group of amateur astronomers who captured footage of a slow-moving object crossing a star field. Its motion initially dismissed as a satellite until frame-by-frame analysis reveals subtle course corrections inconsistent with orbital decay. And the show carefully reconstructs the observation session, emphasizing the observer's familiarity with the night sky, their routine documentation practices, and their initial reluctance to report the footage publicly, underscoring that credibility is often rooted not in spectacle but in hesitation. And as experts debate whether atmospheric drag, sensor error, or classified technology could account for the movement, The episode introduces a parallel forest investigation where motion sensors placed along a remote trail record repeated activations over several nights, each triggered at heights exceeding known animal ranges. And rather than sensationalizing the data, the show focuses on process, showing how false positives are eliminated, how wind patterns are modeled, how overlapping sensor fields confirm vertical movement, and while no definitive subject is identified, the persistence of the activations suggests behavior rather than randomness, reinforcing the episode's emerging theme that repetition itself can be a form of evidence, even when identity remains elusive. And this theme is further developed through historical comparison as the show examines archival cases once dismissed due to lack of corroboration, but now reconsidered in light of modern clustering analysis, revealing that several supposedly isolated Sasquatch sightings occurred within weeks of unexplained aerial phenomena in the same regions, a coincidence the series treats with caution, explicitly acknowledging the risk of retrofitting narratives, yet also arguing that ignoring such overlaps may blind investigators to complex interactions, and this careful balance between openness and restraint defines the episode's tone, refusing to either conflate or compartmentalize prematurely, and interwoven throughout are reflections from sociologists who discuss how human communities respond to repeated anomalies, noting that normalization often replaces panic, leading residents to quietly adjust behavior without public acknowledgement, such as avoiding certain trails at night or accepting strange lights as part of the local landscape. And these subtle adaptations suggest that the impact of the unexplained extends beyond isolated witnesses into communal habit, shaping lived reality in ways that rarely make headlines. And as Part 4 deepens its inquiry, it introduces a controversial but thoughtfully presented hypothesis that some phenomena may not be singular entities, but emergent effects produced by the interaction of multiple variables, such as advanced technology, natural electromagnetic fields, and human sensory limitations, a hypothesis illustrated through simulations showing how light, sound, and movement can combine to create the illusion of structured objects or upright figures. And while skeptics welcome this model as a potential demystification, others point out that simulations explain possibility, not occurrence, and that the frequency and specificity of reports still demand explanation. And this tension fuels a compelling roundtable discussion where experts from different disciplines confront the limits of their own frameworks, acknowledging that interdisciplinary gaps often become repositories for mystery. And the episode's emotional core emerges through a poignant segment featuring a wildlife biologist who recounts a lifelong commitment to empirical rigor shaken by a single encounter with an unseen presence that followed her through dense woodland, matching her pace, remaining just beyond sight, an experience she describes not as terrifying but as profoundly destabilizing because it offered no data to collect, no behavior to categorize, only the undeniable sensation of being observed, and her testimony resonates because it articulates a fear familiar to science itself, the fear of encountering something that resists measurement, and the show allows this moment to breathe, underscored by restrained visuals and ambient sound, before returning to analysis with renewed humility. And as night falls within the episode's chronology, the narrative revisits the magnetic anomaly regions, this time deploying portable sensors that record fluctuations, coinciding with reported sightings, fluctuations too brief to register on large-scale monitoring systems, yet consistent enough to suggest localized disturbance. And physicists debate whether these readings could influence perception by affecting neural processing or sensor accuracy, introducing the provocative idea that some sightings may be as much about altered observation conditions as about external objects, a concept that blurs the line between internal and external reality without collapsing it. And the episode handles this complexity with care, avoiding reductive explanations while emphasizing that perception itself is an active process shaped by environment. And in the closing act, Part 4 returns to the map from the opening, now layered with new data, some points fading as explanations emerge, others glowing brighter as questions deepen, and the narrator reflects on the danger of seeking a single master explanation for phenomena that may be plural by nature, suggesting that the desire for a unified theory can obscure the possibility that different mysteries coexist under similar guises. And the final sequence juxtaposes a clear night sky with a dark forest canopy, the camera tilting upward and downward in slow rhythm, reinforcing the episode's central metaphor that the unknown is not confined to one realm but spans above and around us. And the closing words emphasize that inquiry is not a march towards certainty, but a negotiation with complexity, where every answer reshapes the question that follows, leaving the viewer with a sense of expanded perspective rather than closure, aware that as patterns emerge, so too do new blind spots, and that understanding may require not only better tools, but greater tolerance for ambiguity, setting the stage for further exploration with a promise not of revelation, but of deeper engagement with the edges of what we think we know. Part 5 advances with a noticeable shift in emotional temperature, moving away from cartographic abstraction and methodological debates into a more intimate territory, where the unknown presses directly against individual lives. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, opens with a quiet domestic scene rather than a night sky or forest trail, the camera lingering on an ordinary kitchen, where a couple describes how repeated unexplained events slowly altered the rhythm of their home. Lights flickering without electrical cause, animals reacting violently to empty air, a persistent low-frequency hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And the show uses this vignette not to sensationalize, but to illustrate how prolonged exposure to unresolved anomalies can erode the boundary between curiosity and fatigue. Because unlike brief sightings, these experiences do not end when the camera is turned off. And from this human entry point, the episode expands into a broader examination of duration as an evidentiary factor, asking how repeated low-level phenomena challenge traditional investigative frameworks that favor discrete, documentable events, and the experts acknowledge that science is often ill-equipped to handle experiences defined more by persistence than by spectacle. And this acknowledgement sets the stage for a deep dive into cases where UFO sightings and alleged Sasquatch encounters occur not once, but over months or years in the same locations, forming what investigators cautiously refer to as active zones. And the episode follows one such zone in a rural valley where residents report recurring aerial lights that coincide with unexplained vocalizations in nearby woods. And rather than isolating these reports, the show examines their temporal overlap, revealing patterns where forest activity increases shortly after aerial sightings, a sequence that raises uncomfortable questions about causality without asserting it. And the narrative is careful to frame this as correlation under investigation rather than proof, reinforcing its commitment to intellectual restraint. And to ground this analysis, the episode introduces long-term monitoring equipment installed with community consent, including audio recorders calibrated to capture infrasonic frequencies and skyward cameras programmed for automated tracking. And the footage gathered is presented raw and incomplete, emphasizing the challenges of field research where weather, wildlife, and human interference complicate data collection. Yet within this imperfect dataset, certain consistencies emerge, such as repeated sound patterns that fall outside known animal vocal ranges and light movements that defy typical aircraft behavior. And the show's experts debate whether these consistencies indicate an external source or a feedback loop, where expectation heightens attention, leading observers to notice patterns previously ignored. And this debate is enriched by input from neuroscientists who explain how prolonged uncertainty can sharpen perception in some individuals while dulling it in others, producing divergent experiences within the same environment. And this psychological dimension becomes a crucial layer of the episode, challenging simplistic binaries between objective reality and subjective experience. And as Part 5 progresses, the narrative introduces historical parallels, examining case files from the mid-20th century, where entire communities reported extended waves of strange phenomena, often dismissed later as mass hysteria. Yet when revisited with contemporary understanding of stress, environment, and media influence, these episodes appear more complex, involving genuine anomalous stimuli amplified by social dynamics rather than fabricated from nothing. And this nuanced reinterpretation reframes collective experience not as evidence of delusion, but as a complicated interplay between stimulus and response, and the episode uses this framework to revisit the Valley case, interviewing residents whose reactions vary widely from fear to indifference to quiet acceptance, illustrating that belief is not a monolith, but a spectrum shaped by personality, history, and tolerance for ambiguity. And one particularly striking testimony comes from a local veterinarian who describes treating livestock exhibiting stress injuries with no clear cause, injuries that coincide with nights of reported aerial activity, and while she stops short of attributing cause, her clinical observations add weight to the argument that something external is impacting the environment, even if its nature remains unclear. And this environmental angle expands further as ecologists analyze changes in animal movement patterns using GPS tracking data, noting subtle but statistically significant deviations that align with periods of reported anomalies. Deviations too small to trigger alarm yet too consistent to ignore, and the episode emphasizes that such findings do not prove extraordinary explanations, but do justify continued investigation, positioning curiosity as a rational response rather than a credulous one. And the narrative tension intensifies when one monitoring camera captures a brief but compelling sequence of lights descending toward a forested ridge, followed minutes later by a series of powerful wood knocks echoing through the valley, sounds that seasoned outdoors experts identify as atypical both in force and rhythm. And the show presents this sequence without dramatic scoring, allowing the temporal proximity to speak for itself, and the analysts carefully annotate what is known and unknown, resisting the urge to connect dots prematurely, yet acknowledging that ignoring proximity altogether would be equally unscientific. And this careful navigation of inference becomes the episode's central lesson, demonstrating how responsible investigation occupies a narrow path between skepticism and openness. And as dawn breaks within the episode's timeline, the narrative pauses to reflect on the toll such investigations take on participants, highlighting the emotional labor of living with unresolved questions. And psychologists discuss how humans seek closure not only for comfort, but for identity, noting that ambiguity can destabilize self-narratives, a theme embodied by a resident who admits that years of unexplained events left him oscillating between obsession and denial, illustrating the psychological cost of proximity to mystery. And the show treats this confession with empathy, framing it as a reminder that the pursuit of proof has human consequences beyond intellectual satisfaction. And as Part 5 approaches its conclusion, the episode introduces a philosophical perspective that reframes duration not as a problem, but as a clue, suggesting that phenomena, which persist without escalation or resolution, may not conform to human expectations of event-based causality. Instead, operating according to rhythms or purposes misaligned with our frameworks, a suggestion presented tentatively yet provocatively, inviting viewers to consider that the unknown may not announce itself dramatically, but coexist quietly alongside the familiar. And the final moments of the episode return to the valley at night, cameras recording patiently as nothing happens, emphasizing absence as data, reminding viewers that investigation often involves long stretches of waiting punctuated by brief anomalies, and the narrator reflects on how patience itself becomes a tool, cultivating humility and resilience. And the closing image shows the monitoring equipment still running as the community sleeps, a silent vigil that encapsulates the episode's central insight that the search for understanding is not a sprint toward revelation, but a sustained commitment to attention, and that sometimes the most meaningful evidence lies not in what appears, but in what endures, unresolved yet undeniable, shaping lives through its persistence rather than its clarity, leaving the viewer with a quiet unease tempered by respect for the process, and a growing sense that as the investigation deepens, the line between observer and observed becomes increasingly porous, setting the stage for the questions that will follow as the series continues its careful exploration of the edges of certainty. Part 6 emerges with a sharpened sense of consequence, as if the accumulated weight of prolonged observation recurring anomalies, and human endurance now demands a confrontation with implication rather than mere description. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, opens on a moment of interruption, a routine investigative briefing abruptly halted by incoming data that does not fit prior expectations, a sudden spike across multiple independent sensors separated by miles yet synchronized to the same narrow time window. And the series immediately frames this not as a breakthrough, but as a stress test for its own methodology, because convergence can illuminate truth just as easily as it can expose systemic bias. And the episode devotes considerable time to unpacking how such data synchronization can occur through mundane means, including network latency errors, environmental interference, or human confirmation bias, carefully dismantling the temptation to declare significance prematurely. Yet as each conventional explanation is examined and set aside, the remaining coherence of the data becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, forcing the investigators to confront the uncomfortable reality that their tools may be registering an external stimulus operating across domains. And this possibility shifts the episode's tone from patient curiosity to cautious alertness, not fear but a heightened awareness that the phenomena under study may possess a scale or coordination previously underestimated. And from this technical opening, the narrative pivots to a retrospective examination of earlier cases, now reinterpreted through the lens of synchronization, revealing that several historical incidents dismissed as coincidence exhibit similar temporal clustering when reanalyzed, a discovery presented with restraint yet unmistakable gravity. And the show emphasizes that recognizing patterns retroactively carries risks, but also that refusing to re-examine data in light of new frameworks can entrench error, positioning re-evaluation not as weakness but as intellectual responsibility. And this responsibility becomes a recurring motif as the episode introduces voices from within institutional science who admit, often reluctantly, that career incentives and reputational risk have historically discouraged engagement with anomalous data, creating blind spots where mystery thrives not because it is unknowable, but because it is professionally inconvenient. And these admissions lend the episode a quiet subversive power, reframing the pursuit of the unknown as not only a scientific challenge, but a cultural one, shaped by norms that define what questions are acceptable. And as Part 6 deepens, it returns to the active zone introduced earlier, now under intensified monitoring, where a sequence of events unfolds that test the investigators' emotional detachment, beginning with a series of aerial lights appearing lower and slower than before, their movement tracked in real time by multiple cameras, followed by a sudden surge of infrasonic sound recorded simultaneously across the valley, sound that does not manifest audibly yet produces physiological effects reported by residents, including nausea, anxiety, and disorientation, and medical experts are brought in to analyze these reports, confirming that such symptoms are consistent with exposure to specific frequency ranges, frequencies rarely produced by natural sources in that region. And while the episode stops short of attributing intent, it does not shy away from the implication that whatever generated the sound exerted a tangible influence on human bodies, a development that raises ethical questions about continued observation without intervention. And this ethical tension becomes central as the investigators debate whether to scale back monitoring to avoid potential harm or to continue in pursuit of understanding. A debate presented transparently, revealing the human struggle beneath scientific protocol. And this struggle is mirrored in the forest investigations, where researchers documenting unusual vocalizations encounter an unexpected escalation, tree knocks increasing in volume and complexity following nights of aerial activity, patterns that suggest responsiveness rather than randomness. And the episode carefully avoids anthropomorphic language, instead describing the behavior as contingent, altering in relation to environmental stimuli. And this framing allows the audience to consider agency without assigning identity, maintaining conceptual discipline even as implications grow heavier. And interwoven throughout are reflections from philosophers and ethicists who discuss humanity's historical encounters with the unknown, noting that the line between observation and provocation is often crossed unintentionally, and that many cultural myths frame the unknown as reactive to attention, a notion that resonates uncomfortably with the emerging data. And the episode does not endorse mythological explanations, yet acknowledges that such narratives may encode experiential wisdom about engagement and restraint. And as Part 6 progresses, the narrative introduces a contrasting case, where increased monitoring appears to coincide with a decrease in reported phenomena, an apparent withdrawal that complicates assumptions about observation revealing truth, suggesting instead that attention itself may alter manifestation, whether through psychological priming or external response. And this ambiguity fuels one of the episode's most compelling discussions, questioning whether the goal of investigation should always be maximization of data, or whether there are contexts where less intrusion yields more clarity. And this question is not resolved but left open, reflecting the series' commitment to complexity. And the episode's emotional core crystallizes around a moment of doubt expressed by a lead investigator who admits on camera that the longer the study continues, the less certain she feels about the nature of the phenomena, not because evidence is lacking, but because it points in multiple incompatible directions, a confession that humanizes the scientific process and challenges the myth of linear progress. And this vulnerability resonates as the show revisits witness testimonies, now colored by awareness of potential physical effects, prompting reevaluation of past experiences once attributed solely to fear or imagination. And this reevaluation is handled with sensitivity, avoiding retrospective validation of trauma, while acknowledging that unexplained physiological responses deserve serious consideration. And as night falls again, the episode reaches a pivotal sequence where synchronized data capture aligns with direct observation, investigators witnessing lights overhead, while instruments register infrasonic waves and forest sensors activate in pattern succession. A convergence that is undeniable in its coherence, yet frustratingly opaque in its meaning. And the analysts respond not with exclamation, but with careful documentation, their restraint underscoring the show's ethos that significance does not require spectacle. And the narrator contextualizes this moment by reminding viewers that many scientific revolutions began not with clear answers, but with stubborn anomalies that refused assimilation, and that patience, not proclamation, is often the mark of progress. And as the episode approaches its conclusion, it shifts into reflection, examining the psychological impact on the investigative team itself, noting signs of fatigue, hypervigilance, and altered perception. And psychologists discuss how sustained engagement with uncertainty can blur the boundary between professional inquiry and personal belief, emphasizing the need for reflective practices to maintain objectivity, a meta-awareness that reinforces the series' self-critical stance. And the final act of Part 6 deliberately slows, returning to stillness after escalation, showing empty skies and silent forests as data streams normalize. And this quiet is not framed as relief, but as a reminder that absence and presence are equally part of the investigative landscape. And the narrator reflects on how the search for proof often oscillates between intensity and calm, between moments that feel like thresholds and long stretches of ambiguity. And that meaning emerges not from any single event, but from the discipline of sustained attention. And the closing image lingers on a monitoring screen displaying synchronized timelines, now cleared of anomalies, a visual reset that paradoxically feels more unsettling than resolution, suggesting that whatever was observed may have concluded a cycle rather than revealed itself, leaving behind not answers but a heightened awareness of how little is understood. And the episode ends with a question posed not rhetorically but genuinely, asking whether the pursuit of understanding changes what is being studied or simply reveals the limits of the observer. A question that hangs unresolved as the screen fades, signaling that the investigation has reached a point where deeper inquiry may demand not only better instruments, but a reevaluation of intent, responsibility, and readiness for whatever clarity might entail. Part 7 unfolds with a quieter intensity, the kind that follows escalation rather than precedes it, as if the series understands that after convergence and physiological consequence, the next step is not to push harder, but to listen more carefully. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, opens on reflection rather than action. The investigative team reviewing footage and data not to extract new conclusions, but to examine their own reactions. An unusual but deliberate narrative choice that signals a thematic turn toward reflexivity, because at this stage the mystery is no longer only about what appears in the sky or moves through the forest, but about how humans respond when the unknown refuses to clarify itself. And the episode frames this as a necessary recalibration, reminding viewers that history is filled with moments where premature certainty caused more damage than ignorance. And from this introspective opening, the narrative expands into a broader examination of thresholds, both physical and psychological, exploring the idea that many reported encounters occur at boundaries, dusk and dawn, forest edges, rural-urban interfaces, moments when sensory information is inherently ambiguous, and environmental psychologists explain how such liminal spaces heighten alertness and susceptibility to interpretation. Yet the episode is careful not to reduce sightings to mere misperception, instead suggesting that thresholds may be where subtle phenomena are most detectable, not because they're created there, but because contrast is greatest. And this notion of contrast becomes a structural motif as the episode juxtaposes high technology with primitive environment, advanced sensors against instinctive human awareness, and skepticism alongside belief without privileging either. And the narrative returns to the active zone, now under modified protocol, where investigators deliberately reduce monitoring intensity, limiting artificial light and sound to observe whether phenomena persist absent heightened observation. And this methodological shift is treated as an experiment in restraint, a recognition that interaction itself may be a variable. And the results are ambiguous yet compelling, with reported activity decreasing in frequency, but increasing in clarity. Fewer events, but with stronger coherence, such as a single prolonged light hovering silently at treetop height, observed simultaneously by multiple witnesses without triggering physiological distress. And analysts debate whether this represents adaptation, coincidence, or psychological relief altering perception. And the episode presents these interpretations side by side, allowing uncertainty to remain productive rather than paralyzing. And interwoven with this fieldwork is a historical segment examining how past cultures approach persistent unexplained phenomena, not as puzzles to be solved but as conditions to be lived with, featuring anthropologists who discuss indigenous frameworks that emphasize relationship over classification, a perspective introduced carefully to avoid romanticization, while acknowledging that alternative epistemologies may offer insight into managing uncertainty without erasing it. And this cultural lens provides a counterpoint to the Western scientific impulse toward definitive proof, suggesting that the desire to name and isolate may sometimes obscure understanding rather than enhance it. And the episode uses this contrast to reflect on modern investigative culture, questioning whether the language of proof itself may be insufficient for phenomena that resist stable definition. And this question gains emotional weight through a series of witness updates, revisiting individuals featured earlier to see how their relationship with the unknown has evolved, revealing that some have found peace through acceptance rather than explanation, while others remain driven by unresolved curiosity, illustrating that impact is not uniform and that meaning is constructed as much internally as externally. And one particularly resonant update comes from the wildlife biologist who earlier described being followed through the forest, now explaining that she returned to the same area months later not to gather data, but to confront her own fear, an experience she describes as anticlimactic yet transformative, because nothing happened, and this absence allowed her to reclaim agency without closure, a subtle but powerful reminder that resolution does not always come in the form of answers. And as Part 7 progresses, the narrative introduces a new layer of analysis, focusing on time perception, with neuroscientists explaining how anomalous experiences often distort subjective time, making brief events feel extended or prolonged encounters feel instantaneous, a phenomenon corroborated by multiple witnesses across different cases. And this temporal distortion complicates timelines and challenges investigators to account for experiential duration alongside recorded time, reinforcing the episode's central argument that human experience cannot be cleanly separated from data without losing essential context. And the episode explores this complexity through a case where synchronized cameras record a light visible for less than 10 seconds, while witnesses report an encounter lasting several minutes. And rather than dismissing the discrepancy, the show treats it as a clue, suggesting that altered states of attention may accompany or facilitate perception of subtle phenomena, a hypothesis presented cautiously yet supported by emerging research on attention and awareness. And this scientific grounding prevents the discussion from drifting into speculation while still expanding the conceptual frame. And the forest investigations echo this theme as acoustic analysts identify patterns in recorded vocalizations that suggest call and response dynamics, not in the sense of communication, but in temporal spacing that adapts to environmental feedback, such as echoes and terrain, indicating responsiveness without implying intention, a distinction the episode maintains rigorously. And this responsiveness becomes a metaphor for the investigation itself, a process shaped by what it encounters. And as Part 7 nears its conclusion, the narrative circles back to ethics, revisiting the earlier question of whether observation constitutes intrusion, now enriched by data suggesting that reduced monitoring correlates with decreased distress, prompting a sober discussion about the responsibilities of inquiry when potential harm is identified. And the show does not offer easy answers, but emphasizes that ethical reflection must evolve alongside evidence, not trail behind it. And the episode's final sequence is deliberately understated, featuring a single uninterrupted shot of the forest at twilight. No music, no narration, just ambient sound, inviting the viewer into the same state of attentive waiting that defines the investigator's work. And after an extended pause, the narrator speaks softly, reflecting on how the pursuit of proof often assumes that clarity is the ultimate goal, yet experience suggests that understanding may instead involve learning how to coexist with uncertainty without surrendering rigor or curiosity. And this reframing feels earned after the preceding escalation, offering not resolution but recalibration. And the closing words emphasize that mysteries do not always demand conquest. Sometimes they demand patience, respect, and self-awareness. And as the screen fades, the sense lingers that the investigation has entered a new phase, one less concerned with forcing revelation and more attuned to the conditions under which revelation might responsibly occur, leaving the viewer with a contemplative pause rather than anticipation alone, and preparing the ground for what may follow when inquiry continues not as pursuit but as dialogue with the unknown. Part 8 resumes, not with discovery, but with aftermath, carrying forward the quiet recalibration established earlier and pushing it into a new terrain where consequence replaces curiosity as the dominant emotional register. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the Trees, opens with the investigative team confronting an unexpected outcome of their restraint-based protocol, namely that reduced intrusion has not eliminated phenomena, but has changed how they manifest and how they are remembered. And the episode frames this shift as neither success nor failure, but as transformation, because what emerges now is less frequent yet more coherent, less dramatic yet more difficult to dismiss. And the narrative immediately grounds this idea in a single extended case, a rural community that reported no incidents for several weeks following the protocol change, only to experience a single night of concentrated activity, marked by a slow-moving aerial glow visible to dozens of residents simultaneously, an event notable not for its spectacle but for its calm, as witnesses consistently describe the absence of fear, panic, or physiological distress, a stark contrast to earlier encounters. And psychologists interviewed in the episode suggest that emotional context may be as critical as sensory input in shaping anomalous experience, proposing that when anticipation and anxiety are lowered, perception may become more stable rather than heightened, a counterintuitive idea that reframes the relationship between fear and attention. And this reframing becomes central as the episode explores how the human nervous system mediates encounters with the unknown, emphasizing regulation over reactivity. And from this human-centered perspective, the narrative broadens to examine how institutions respond when anomalies stabilize rather than escalate, featuring candid interviews with officials who admit that persistent low-level phenomena are often deprioritized because they do not trigger crisis thresholds, creating a bureaucratic blind spot where events that are too strange to ignore yet too calm to alarm quietly accumulate without formal acknowledgement. And this institutional inertia is contrasted with the lived reality of witnesses who must integrate these experiences into daily life without validation or explanation. And the episode treats this gap with empathy, highlighting how uncertainty becomes a private burden when public language fails to accommodate it. And as Part 8 unfolds, the forest investigations take on a new character as well, with researchers documenting subtle environmental changes rather than overactivity, noting altered growth patterns in vegetation, unusual soil compaction along trails, and shifts in nocturnal animal behavior that do not correspond to known ecological drivers. And while each observation alone is inconclusive, the episode emphasizes their convergence over time, presenting them as signals of disturbance rather than evidence of presence, a distinction that allows inquiry to proceed without premature identification. And ecologists stress that ecosystems often register influence before cause is understood, citing historical examples where environmental impact preceded discovery of invasive species or pollutants, a comparison that grounds speculation in precedent while maintaining caution. And this ecological framing dovetails with renewed analysis of aerial data, where atmospheric scientists identify transient ionization patterns coinciding with reported lights, patterns too localized to be explained by conventional weather phenomena, yet too brief to leave lasting traces. And the episode carefully explains the limitations of measurement, underscoring that detection does not imply comprehension, and that many natural processes were observed long before they were understood, positioning the current anomalies within a broader history of scientific lag. And this historical humility becomes a recurring refrain as the narrative revisits early modern astronomy and microbiology, reminding viewers that resistance to the unseen is not new, but a recurring stage in epistemic expansion. And interwoven with these analytical threads are deeply personal updates from witnesses whose relationship with their experiences has evolved in unexpected ways, including a former skeptic who describes becoming less interested in proving what he saw and more interested in how it changed his priorities, shifting his sense of scale and significance. And the show presents this not as conversion, but as recalibration, emphasizing that meaning does not require explanation. And this theme is reinforced by a segment on memory consolidation, where neuroscientists discuss how emotionally neutral anomalous experiences may integrate more smoothly into identity than fear-based ones, reducing cognitive dissonance while preserving mystery, a finding that resonates with the calm nature of the recent events. And as Part 8 advances, the narrative introduces a subtle but profound question about ownership of inquiry, asking who has the right to investigate phenomena that affect communities, yet defy conventional jurisdiction, a question explored through discussions with Indigenous leaders who articulate concerns about external researchers imposing frameworks without consent. And while the episode avoids appropriating spiritual explanations, it acknowledges the ethical imperative to respect local knowledge systems and lived relationships with place, suggesting that collaboration rather than extraction may be essential for responsible study. And this ethical expansion adds depth to the series, framing investigation as a social act rather than a purely technical one. And the episode's tension builds quietly as new monitoring data reveals a gradual return of low-frequency signals, weaker than before yet persistent, prompting debate about whether these signals represent background conditions always present but only recently recognized, or a diminished echo of earlier activity. And this ambiguity underscores the episode's central argument that phenomena may not arrive and depart on human timelines, instead operating continuously with varying visibility. And this idea is illustrated through a compelling analogy to deep-sea bioluminescence, where organisms remain invisible until conditions align, a metaphor that feels earned rather than decorative, and the climax of Part 8 is deliberately understated, featuring a single clear night where nothing extraordinary occurs except a shared moment of attention, investigators and residents alike observing the sky without expectation, an act framed as data collection and communal ritual simultaneously, blurring the line between science and experience, and the narrator reflects on how the absence of anomaly can be as instructive as its presence, teaching patience and recalibrating desire for revelation. And in the closing moments, the episode returns to the question of disguise, suggesting that concealment may not be intentional but emergent, arising from the interaction between subtle phenomena and limited perception, and that what appears hidden may simply be operating at scales misaligned with human attention. And the final image lingers on a wide landscape shot slowly transitioning from night to dawn, light revealing nothing new, yet altering everything. And the narrator concludes that understanding may not arrive as disclosure but as adaptation, learning to perceive without forcing clarity, to coexist with unanswered questions without surrendering curiosity. And this quiet resolution feels less like an ending than a deep breath before continuation, signaling that the investigation has matured into a practice rather than a hunt, and that what lies ahead may challenge not only what we believe about the unknown, but how we believe at all. Part 9 opens with a subtle sense of reckoning, as though the investigation, having learned restraint and coexistence, is now compelled to confront the consequences of long-term exposure to the unexplained, not in the form of dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of insight that alters perspective irreversibly. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the Trees, begins by returning to data gathered months earlier, material that once seemed inconclusive, but now appears differently when viewed through the lens of endurance rather than immediacy. And the episode frames this return as an act of maturation, suggesting that some evidence only becomes legible once the investigator has changed, and the narrative follows analysts as they re-examine extended timelines, layering sensor readings, witness reports, and environmental markers to reveal rhythms previously obscured by event-focused analysis. Rhythms that suggest cyclical fluctuation rather than linear progression. And this discovery prompts a reframing of the central question away from what the phenomena are toward how they behave over time, an approach that aligns more closely with ecological and astronomical sciences than with forensic investigation. And this methodological pivot becomes the episode's intellectual backbone, grounding speculation in patterns of recurrence and dormancy observed across natural systems. And from this analytical foundation, the narrative transitions to the human dimension, exploring how witnesses experience these cycles emotionally, featuring interviews with individuals who describe a waxing and waning of attention, moments when curiosity intensifies followed by periods of indifference, and psychologists interpret these oscillations as adaptive responses to sustained uncertainty, mechanisms by which the mind preserves functionality in the absence of closure. And this insight reframes disengagement not as denial, but as resilience and necessary counterpart to vigilance. And the episode treats the psychological adaptation as evidence in its own right, demonstrating that the unknown exerts pressure not only on instruments but on cognition. And as Part 9 unfolds, the investigation revisits the forest with a new emphasis on absence, documenting long stretches where previously active zones remain quiet, and ecologists caution against interpreting silence as resolution, noting that many species and processes operate in pulses separated by dormancy, and this ecological analogy extends to the aerial phenomena as well, where atmospheric scientists identify seasonal variables that may influence visibility and interaction, such as ion density, temperature gradients, and geomagnetic conditions. And while these factors do not explain origin, they offer context, suggesting that manifestation may depend as much on environment as on intent, a distinction that tempers both fear and expectation. And the episode weaves these scientific Perspectives with historical accounts of recurring waves of sightings, revealing that many famous flaps were preceded and followed by years of relative quiet, a pattern that undermines narratives of escalation and instead supports a model of intermittent interaction. And this model gains further traction through archival analysis of witness correspondence, letters written decades apart that describe remarkably similar emotional trajectories from shock to obsession to integration, a consistency that suggests a shared human response to prolonged ambiguity. And the show presents these letters with care, emphasizing tone rather than content, allowing the emotional cadence to speak across time. And this historical continuity lends depth to the investigation, situating current events within a lineage of encounter rather than an isolated moment. And as Part 9 progresses, the narrative introduces a challenging question about agency. Not whether the phenomena possess it, but whether humans do in their response, examining how choices made by investigators and communities shape outcomes. And this question is explored through a case study where a community opted to halt all external investigation, choosing privacy over explanation. And the episode follows up months later to find that reported activity diminished, but did not vanish, instead becoming normalized within local narratives, treated as an occasional feature of place rather than an anomaly demanding resolution. And sociologists analyze this shift as an assertion of agency, a refusal to allow the unknown to dominate identity. And this perspective complicates the assumption that investigation is always the highest good, suggesting that sometimes containment of meaning is as important as expansion. And this ethical nuance adds weight to the series' evolving philosophy. And the episode balances this with a contrasting case, where intense media attention amplified reports and anxiety without increasing clarity, reinforcing the idea that attention itself is a force with measurable effects. And this realization feeds into a broader discussion about modern amplification mechanisms, how social media accelerates pattern formation and belief solidification, often outpacing evidence. And the show does not condemn these platforms, but treats them as environmental factors that shape perception, requiring investigators to account for information ecology alongside physical environment. And this meta-awareness elevates Part 9 beyond case analysis into cultural critique, examining how the unknown is processed in an era of constant connectivity. And interspersed throughout are moments of quiet reflection from the investigative team, acknowledging how their own relationship with certainty has shifted, with one analyst admitting that early in the project he sought proof as validation, whereas now he values coherence and integrity over definitive answers, a shift presented not as resignation but as growth. And this evolution mirrors the episode's broader argument that maturity and inquiry involves accepting limits without abandoning curiosity. And as the narrative deepens, it introduces an unexpected but grounding segment on training and preparedness, exploring how investigators develop protocols not for discovery, but for personal well-being, including mindfulness practices and structured disengagement to counter hypervigilance. And psychologists emphasize that such practices do not dull perception but enhance discernment, preventing burnout and projection. And this focus on investigator health underscores the human cost of sustained engagement with mystery, reinforcing that the pursuit of proof is lived labor rather than abstract quest. And the episode's tension builds subtly as new data hints at the beginning of another cycle, faint signals emerging at the edge of detection, prompting debate about whether to re-engage fully or maintain distance. And this debate is framed not as conflict but as deliberation, reflecting the series' commitment to ethical reflexivity. And the climax of Part 9 is characteristically understated, featuring a night where faint lights appear briefly and fade without escalation, observed by seasoned witnesses who respond with calm acknowledgement rather than excitement, a response that marks a significant shift from earlier reactions. And the narrator reflects on how familiarity does not necessarily breed contempt but can foster perspective, allowing the extraordinary to be contextualized rather than fetishized. And this moment encapsulates the episode's central insight that meaning evolves through relationship rather than conquest. And in the closing act, the episode turns explicitly philosophical, questioning whether the concept of proof itself is adequate for phenomena that manifest intermittently and ambiguously, suggesting that some aspects of reality may be better approached through models of engagement and response rather than verification and falsification, a provocative idea presented without dogma, inviting contemplation rather than adherence, and the final sequence returns to a simple image, a long static shot of sky and forest meeting at the horizon, unchanged yet subtly different in light, and the narrator concludes that the investigation has reached a stage where progress is measured not by answers gained, but by questions refined, and that the unknown, far from being an enemy of understanding, may be its catalyst, forcing humility, patience, and expanded imagination. And as the screen fades, the sense remains that another cycle may be beginning, not as escalation, but as continuation, and that what lies ahead will test not the limits of technology, but the depth of wisdom with which inquiry is pursued, leaving the viewer poised between anticipation and acceptance, aware that the search for proof is inseparable from the search for meaning, and that both are ongoing processes rather than destinations. Part 10 unfolds with a sense of deliberate gravity, as though the investigation has crossed an invisible threshold where accumulation gives way to implication. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, opens by acknowledging that sustained inquiry does not merely reveal phenomena, but reshapes the frameworks used to interpret reality itself. And the episode frames this moment as a reckoning not with the unknown, but with the assumptions brought to it, beginning with a quiet montage of earlier evidence, now replayed without commentary, lights moving across the sky, forest shadows shifting, sensor graphs rising and falling, images that once felt charged with urgency now presented as familiar, and this familiarity is not used to diminish their strangeness, but to illustrate how repeated exposure alters interpretation, encouraging viewers to recognize that perception is not static, but adaptive, and from this reflective opening the narrative moves into a comprehensive synthesis phase, where analysts attempt to integrate aerial, terrestrial, environmental, and psychological data into a cohesive model, not a theory of origin, but a framework of interaction, and this distinction is emphasized repeatedly, because the episode is careful to avoid the trap of total explanation, instead focusing on describing how different variables appear to influence manifestation, such as environmental conditions, human attention levels, and technological presence, and this systems-based approach marks a significant evolution from earlier parts, reflecting a maturation of inquiry driven by complexity rather than frustration. And as the model takes shape, the episode introduces the concept of thresholds of visibility, proposing that phenomena may exist continuously, but only cross into detectability when multiple conditions align, a concept supported by analogies to natural processes like auroras and seismic tremors, which require specific alignments to become perceptible. And this analogy grounds speculation in familiar science while preserving the uniqueness of the subject matter. And from this conceptual foundation, the narrative turns to a controversial but thoughtfully presented segment examining classified research into perception and signal detection, with experts discussing how military and scientific institutions have long studied the limits of human sensing, not only to extend capability, but to understand vulnerability. And while the episode avoids conspiratorial framing, it acknowledges that knowledge asymmetry is an inherent feature of modern society, complicating public understanding of unexplained phenomena. And this acknowledgement introduces a subtle tension, as the show questions how much uncertainty is genuine and how much is manufactured by structural opacity. And this tension is explored through interviews with former analysts who describe encountering anomalous data that defied categorization, yet was sidelined due to lack of actionable threat, reinforcing the idea that significance is often defined institutionally rather than ontologically. And this realization deepens the series' critique of how knowledge is filtered before reaching public discourse. And as Part 10 progresses, the narrative re-engages with the forest investigations through a new lens, focusing less on identification and more on interaction patterns, analyzing how reported movements correlate with human presence, light levels, and sound. And researchers note that activity appears to avoid direct confrontation while remaining proximal, a behavior pattern described carefully as evasive rather than intentional. And this distinction allows the episode to discuss agency without anthropomorphism, maintaining analytical rigor even as implications grow more complex. And this pattern is mirrored in aerial data, where objects appear to adjust trajectory to maintain distance rather than approach, a behavior that challenges narratives of surveillance or threat while still implying awareness of human activity. And the show presents these findings with measured language, emphasizing that responsiveness does not equate to motive. And this linguistic discipline becomes a theme in itself as linguists and philosophers discuss how language shapes belief, noting that terms like object, creature, and encounter carry implicit assumptions that can bias interpretation. And the episode invites viewers to consider adopting provisional language as a tool for clearer thinking, a subtle but powerful suggestion that aligns with the series' evolving ethos, and interwoven throughout are updates from communities previously featured, now reflecting on how their relationship with the phenomena has stabilized, with reports of fear giving way to routine acknowledgement. And sociologists interpret this normalization as a coping strategy that allows communities to function without denial or obsession, highlighting human adaptability as a central factor in the unfolding story. And this adaptability is contrasted with moments where rigid belief, whether skeptical or affirming, leads to conflict or distress, reinforcing the episode's argument that flexibility of interpretation is essential when confronting the ambiguous. And as Part 10 nears its climax, the narrative introduces a rare moment of collective synthesis, a roundtable where experts from disparate fields articulate what has changed in their thinking since the investigation began, and their reflections converge on a shared admission that certainty has become less important than coherence, that the goal is no longer to declare what the phenomena are, but to describe how they relate to environment and observer. And this convergence feels earned rather than forced, the product of sustained engagement rather than rhetorical alignment. And the episode allows this moment to stand without dramatic emphasis, trusting the audience to recognize its significance. And the climax itself is understated, featuring a brief resurgence of activity that aligns closely with the proposed interaction model. Lights appearing during a narrow environmental window, forest sensors activating without escalation, and witnesses reporting calm awareness rather than shock. A convergence that does not prove the model but supports its utility. And the analysts respond with cautious affirmation, emphasizing that usefulness does not equal truth, a distinction that underscores the series' commitment to epistemic humility. And in the closing act, Part 10 turns inward once more, examining the psychological shift from seeking answers to cultivating discernment, with experts discussing how sustained uncertainty can foster cognitive flexibility, patience, and tolerance for complexity, traits increasingly valuable in a world defined by rapid information and premature conclusions. And this reflection broadens the episode's relevance beyond unexplained phenomena, positioning the investigation as a case study in how humans might engage responsibly with any complex, ambiguous system. And the final sequence returns to a simple act of observation, investigators and residents alike watching the night sky without instruments, not as abandonment of science, but as acknowledgement that experience and measurement coexist. And the narrator reflects on how the desire to know often masks a deeper desire to control, suggesting that the most profound shift in the investigation has been the relinquishing of control in favor of attentive presence. And as the screen fades, the sense is not of closure but of readiness, a readiness to continue inquiry without demanding resolution, to recognize that some truths may emerge gradually through relationship rather than revelation, and that the unknown, far from being conquered, may become a teacher in how to think, observe, and live with greater humility. And this quiet confidence carries the series forward, signaling that the final chapters will not resolve the mystery, but will clarify what it means to pursue understanding in a world where certainty is rare and curiosity endures. Part 11 arrives with the quiet weight of culmination, not as an ending, but as a moment when the investigation pauses long enough to recognize how far it has traveled from its original questions. And this chapter of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the Trees, opens by revisiting the very first premise that launched the series, the idea that proof exists somewhere waiting to be uncovered, and the episode immediately complicates this premise by acknowledging that what has been gathered over time does not resemble proof in the traditional sense, but rather a dense field of relationships, interactions, and constraints that together outline the shape of something resistant to final capture. And this realization is framed not as disappointment, but as intellectual honesty, because the investigation has revealed that certainty is not always the natural endpoint of inquiry. And from this reflective opening, the narrative moves into its most integrative phase yet, assembling strands from across the series into a layered portrait of engagement with the unknown, beginning with a comprehensive review of how investigative methods evolved in response to evidence, from early attempts at isolation and categorization to later emphasis on interaction, duration, and ethical restraint. And the episode treats this evolution as data in itself, suggesting that how questions change may be as revealing as the answers sought. And this meta-perspective deepens the series' philosophical dimension, positioning the investigation as both subject and object to study. And as Part 11 unfolds, the narrative focuses on legacy, asking what remains once active investigation slows. And this question is explored through follow-up visits to communities that once defined themselves by anomaly and now integrate quietly into local identity, with residents describing how the unexplained has become neither feared nor fetishized, but contextualized, an occasional reminder of limits rather than a disruption of daily life. And sociologists interpret this normalization as a form of collective meaning-making, a way of preserving social cohesion without resolving ambiguity. And this insight reinforces the series' emerging argument that human systems are remarkably adept at absorbing uncertainty when given time and space. And the episode contrasts this communal adaptation with individual journeys, revisiting key witnesses whose experiences shaped earlier chapters, now reflecting on how their understanding has matured, with many expressing that the need to convince others has faded, replaced by a quieter confidence in lived experience. And the show presents this shift not as withdrawal, but as integration, a movement from external validation toward internal coherence. And this personal evolution mirrors the broader investigative arc, reinforcing thematic consistency. And as Part 11 deepens its synthesis, it turns to the role of narrative itself, inviting historians and media, scholars to discuss how stories of the unknown are constructed, transmitted, and transformed, and how framing influences not only public perception but investigative direction, noting that early sensational framing often narrows inquiry by privileging spectacle over process, whereas sustained, restrained narrative allows complexity to surface. And this self-awareness extends to the series itself, which acknowledges its own influence on witnesses and communities, recognizing that documentation is never neutral. And this acknowledgement marks a moment of ethical maturity, as the show reflects openly on the responsibility that comes with attention. And from this reflexive vantage point, the narrative returns to data one last time, not to extract new anomalies but to assess stability, examining whether long-term monitoring has altered baseline conditions. And researchers report that while active phenomena fluctuate, underlying environmental measures have returned to expected ranges, suggesting that whatever interactions occurred did not result in lasting disruption, a finding that tempers earlier concern while raising new questions about transience and impact. And this balance of reassurance and mystery typifies the episode's tone, resisting both alarmism and complacency. And the episode further explores the concept of limits, featuring philosophers of science who argue that the expectation of total explanation may itself be a cultural artifact rooted in control-oriented epistemologies, and that other modes of knowing emphasize sufficiency over completeness, understanding enough to act wisely rather than enough to conclude definitively. And this perspective resonates with the investigation's outcome, suggesting that while origin remains elusive, Patterns of interaction are sufficiently understood to inform ethical engagement, and this reframing feels like a quiet resolution, not because questions are answered, but because the terms of inquiry have stabilized. And as Part 11 approaches its emotional core, the narrative highlights a moment of deliberate closure enacted by the investigative team, the dismantling of monitoring equipment in the active zone, an act presented without triumph or regret, framed instead as acknowledgement that prolonged observation has reached diminishing returns. And this decision is contextualized by discussions of research saturation, a concept from qualitative science where additional data yields repetition rather than insight. And the show emphasizes that knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to begin, a lesson rarely celebrated but deeply relevant. And the scene is handled with restraint, showing equipment packed away, landscapes unchanged, and investigators expressing a mixture of relief and uncertainty, human emotions that ground the abstract themes. And interwoven with this closure is a final round of expert reflection, where scientists, psychologists, and ethicists articulate what they would do differently if the investigation began anew, many citing the importance of slower pacing, earlier ethical reflection, and broader interdisciplinary collaboration, admissions that lend credibility by acknowledging imperfection. And as Part 11 moves toward its conclusion, the narrative turns explicitly toward the audience, not through direct address, but through thematic invitation, suggesting that the story does not end with the series, but continues in how viewers interpret unexplained experiences in their own lives, whether through fear, dismissal, curiosity, or humility, and the narrator reflects on how the unknown functions as a mirror, revealing not what lies beyond, but how we orient ourselves toward uncertainty. And this reflection ties back to the title, questioning whether disguise implies intention or simply perception limited by scale and context. And the episode suggests that what appears hidden may be neither hostile nor benevolent, but indifferent, existing according to its own parameters, intersecting with human awareness only briefly. And this neutrality is presented as both unsettling and liberating, freeing inquiry from narratives of threat or salvation. And in the closing sequence, the episode returns to a familiar visual motif, the horizon where sky meets forest, now filmed in steady daylight rather than night, a symbolic shift that suggests clarity of perspective rather than revelation of content. And the narrator offers a final meditation on proof, proposing that the most enduring proof gathered may not be of extraterrestrial craft or undiscovered beings, but of humanity's capacity to adapt its thinking when certainty fails, to refine questions rather than cling to answers. And this idea resonates as the camera lingers on ordinary landscapes that once felt charged with mystery, now revealed as neither resolved nor diminished, simply contextualized. And the episode closes with a sense of calm continuity, signaling that, while the investigation as documented may be concluding, the conditions that gave rise to it persist, and that the unknown remains not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a boundary that shapes how knowledge grows, inviting future inquiry tempered by humility, patience, and respect, and leaving the viewer with the understanding that endings in such pursuits are provisional, meaningful not because they close questions, but because they clarify how to live alongside them. Part 12 unfolds as a deliberate and reflective coda, not an epilogue that seals meaning, but a final widening of perspective that allows the entire journey of UFO in disguise, Sasquatch in the trees, to settle into something both complete and open-ended. And it begins by returning to the question that quietly haunted every prior chapter, not what the phenomena are, but what it means to search for proof in a world where evidence, interpretation, and belief exist in constant negotiation. And the episode frames this final movement as an act of integration, drawing together the emotional, intellectual, and ethical strands that have accumulated over time, opening with a slow re-examination of moments once charged with urgency, now viewed through the softened lens of experience. Witnesses revisiting recordings without the tremor of expectation, analysts reviewing data with calm familiarity, landscapes shown not as sites of anomaly, but as enduring environments that hosted fleeting intersections. And this tonal shift signals that the series is less concerned with revelation than with understanding the consequences of sustained attention. And from this contemplative opening, the narrative moves into its most philosophical territory yet, inviting thinkers from across disciplines to reflect on how humans historically have responded to phenomena that resist categorization, drawing parallels to early astronomical observations, deep-sea exploration, and even the discovery of microorganisms, noting that in each case the unknown initially provoked myth, fear, and speculation before gradually being integrated into broader models of reality. Yet the episode is careful to emphasize that not all mysteries follow this trajectory, and that some remain structurally resistant to resolution, not due to lack of intelligence or technology, but because they exist at the margins of perception itself. And this acknowledgement reframes the investigation not as incomplete science, but as engagement with a boundary condition of knowledge, a space where inquiry reveals its own limits. And this idea is explored through extended discussion of epistemology, with scholars explaining how proof is not a universal standard, but a culturally situated one, dependent on shared assumptions about causality, observation, and replication. And the episode gently challenges viewers to consider whether demanding proof in its strictest sense may sometimes obscure more subtle forms of understanding, such as pattern recognition, contextual coherence, and ethical response. And as Part 12 deepens this exploration, it revisits the most persistent phenomena documented across the series: the lights, the movements, the sounds, now presented not as isolated events, but as recurring motifs that suggest consistency without explanation. And analysts discuss how repetition without escalation can itself be meaningful, indicating stability rather than intrusion. And this perspective contrasts sharply with early interpretations that framed recurrence as threat or surveillance, illustrating how interpretive frameworks evolve over time. And the narrative underscores that nothing in the collected data supports imminent danger or deliberate hostility, a conclusion reached not through dismissal, but through long-term observation. And this reassurance is balanced by humility, acknowledging the absence of threat does not equal full understanding. And from this balanced stance, the episode turns toward the human impact of the investigation, examining how participation in the search for the unknown reshaped those involved, with investigators describing shifts in how they approach uncertainty in other areas of life, reporting increased patience, skepticism tempered by openness, and a greater tolerance for ambiguity. And psychologists contextualize these changes as adaptive responses to prolonged engagement with unresolved questions, suggesting that such experiences can foster cognitive resilience when supported by community and reflection. And this human dimension is further explored through intimate portraits of witnesses who once felt isolated by their experiences and now describe a sense of quiet acceptance, not because answers are provided, but because their stories were heard and contextualized without ridicule or sensationalism. And the episode emphasizes that validation does not require explanation, a subtle but profound point that reframes the ethics of investigation. And as Part 12 continues, it confronts the potential critique that the series avoids decisive conclusions, addressing this head-on through candid discussion among the production team and consultants, who argue that restraint is not avoidance, but fidelity to evidence, and that forcing resolution where data does not support it risks undermining trust. And this transparency reinforces the credibility of the narrative while modeling intellectual integrity. And the episode situates this choice within a broader media landscape that often rewards certainty over accuracy, inviting viewers to reflect on their own consumption habits and the comfort derived from definitive answers, even when such answers may be premature or unfounded. And this self-reflexive turn extends to the title itself, revisiting the notion of disguise, questioning whether it implies deception or simply misalignment between scale and perception. And philosophers suggest that many natural processes appear disguised not because they are hidden, but because human senses evolved for survival rather than comprehension of all phenomena. And this reframing dissolves the binary between known and unknown, replacing it with a continuum of visibility. And as the episode approaches its emotional center, it returns to the landscapes that anchored the investigation, now filmed in different seasons, emphasizing continuity and change, forests transitioning through light and shadow, skies shifting with weather and time. And the narrator reflects on how these environments remain indifferent to human questions, yet serve as mirrors for them, hosting curiosity without answering it. And this imagery reinforces the series' final thematic assertion that the unknown is not an external adversary, but a relational space shaped by attention, interpretation, and humility. And from this contemplative height, the narrative introduces its final synthesis, articulating what the investigation has ultimately demonstrated: not evidence of extraterrestrial technology or undiscovered species, but the capacity for interdisciplinary inquiry to coexist without forced consensus, the value of long-term observation over reactive interpretation, and the ethical importance of knowing when to pause. And this synthesis is presented not as doctrine but as invitation, encouraging viewers to apply similar principles when encountering uncertainty in their own lives, whether scientific, social, or personal. And the episode carefully avoids prescriptive language, trusting that meaning emerges through resonance rather than instruction. And in its closing movement, Part 12 addresses the future, acknowledging that unexplained phenomena will continue to be reported, debated, and investigated, and that this series represents only one chapter in a much longer human story of curiosity. And experts discuss how future technologies may reveal new dimensions of the same phenomena or render current questions obsolete. Yet they caution that technological advancement does not guarantee epistemic clarity, and that wisdom lies in aligning tools with thoughtful frameworks. And this forward-looking perspective is grounded by a final return to the present moment, investigators standing together in silence, not in anticipation of event, but in acknowledgement of completion. And the narrator offers a final meditation on proof, suggesting that the most enduring proof uncovered is not of something beyond humanity, but of humanity's ability to revise its questions, to listen without domination, and to remain curious without becoming consumed. And the episode closes with an image of open sky fading into daylight, a symbolic gesture that rejects dramatic finality in favor of continuity. And as the screen fades, the message is clear without being spoken directly, that the search for understanding is not a linear path toward certainty, but a practice of engagement that shapes those who undertake it, and that the unknown, far from being eliminated, remains a vital boundary that invites humility, imagination, and restraint. And with this quiet affirmation, the series concludes not by solving the mystery, but by redefining the value of seeking, leaving the audience not with answers to carry, but with a way of looking that endures beyond the final frame.